Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. First, as many of you know, although I can read very well, very well. I can read, I can read English very well. I don't speak it. I don't speak it, but after 2 weeks on vacation alone in Austria and Germany, I had to try, and now I'm encouraged. It's a pleasure for me, as one of the first and few black journalists in Brazil, to have Enoch Aboh, who is physically at UFBA, Universidade Federal da Bahia, and I had the pleasure of meet there at Fort AGG. Enoch, together with Salikoko Mufuene, who was with us at UFBA 2 years ago, and Michael de Graaf, have incomparably enriched generative studies from an Africanist perspective. His works have shown how African language contribute to linguistic theory, and how generative theory is not a white linguist theory as criticized by colleagues in applied linguistics. So thank you very much, Enoch. You have the word.
Yeah, thanks, Carlo Felipe. First, I would like to thank you very much for this nice introduction, and also for inviting me to join this group. And I would like to also thank Lilian for making it possible for me to actually come here, at the university to meet the group and share also my work with you, and also relate back to Benin, where I'm from. Right now I'm relating, to Benin like every day, through the food, and that's a really nice way to connect to a new ecology. And so I'm really happy to be here to share some of the ideas that I've been working with, for a while now, and I would like to basically present this to you. And I'm also really grateful to Selena for taking my turn, because of the technical kind of issue I had previously to connect. And also, in a sense, making connection to some of the work that I was doing. And in this case, to show that languages are much more similar than the kind of, show on the surface. And that's precisely what I would like to talk about today. The fact that syntax is, heavily constrained, and we need to understand how this constraint actually kind of comes about. And I hope, Nunez would kind of buy into this, and maybe, later on we can have some interesting discussion about this. I would like to start this talk then by using a quote by, from Felix Ameka, who basically said humans are the only species with more than 7,000 languages. Even birds don't reach that number. This diversity defines us, but in research, we often focus on standardization. So what Felix was trying to say is that look at, languages out there, and you will find this wonderful, range of variations, and we should be working on this variation rather than, working on standard languages and imposing standard languages on people. And he's kind of joined, in this, how do you say, contemplation of the diversity in human languages by people like Levinson, who said there is no other animal on planet, as far as we know, which has such myriad variants of form and meaning at every level in its communication system. And again, you find Tomasello, who says something like, all individuals of all social species, with one exception, can communicate effectively using their evolved communicative displays and possibly signals with all other individuals of their species. The one exception is, of course, humans. And this speaks to us, right? Because even within the same family, it may happen that you will be using systems, linguistic systems that your other siblings are not using. So when we look at human languages in the world, The conclusion that we want to make is that humans appear very creative linguistically. But this is a puzzle, right? Because if you think about, this creativity that we have, and how, we can be very, extraordinary in developing new devices, new technologies, then you wonder whether 7,000 languages is a lot. And especially if you think about this number in terms of evolution, and you assume that languages emerge somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, then actually 7,000 languages is very restricted. It's a small number. And this is something that I think Chomsky has already mentioned in his metaphor of the Martian scientist, where he says, a Martian scientist observing humans might conclude that there is just a single language with minor variants. The reason is that the particular aspect of human nature that underlies the growth of language allows very restricted options. Is this limiting? Of course. Is it liberating? Also, of course. It is these very restrictions that make it possible for a rich and intricate system of expression of thought to develop in similar ways on the basis of very rudimentary, scattered, and varied experience. So Chomsky has already kind of highlighted the fact that even though we see a lot of variation on the surface, underlyingly the variation is heavily restricted. But then we seem to have adopted a wrong perspective in modern linguistics, in the sense that we try to develop a linguistic theory that is following Chomsky's own work from the 60s, that is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker learner in a completely homogeneous speech community. And this speaker learner is supposed or assumed to know its language perfectly. And this is where I say, well, we had the right answer from Chomsky in terms of the limitations that we find in human beings in terms of variation, but we actually got an inadequate perspective ecologically speaking. And this makes sense if you're coming from a country like mine, which is Benin, which is what, like 100,000 square kilometers, so it's pretty small country. It has 56 languages involving six different language families. Education in Benin is in French, and only in French. And in secondary school, pupils are introduced to English, and then later on in secondary school, they are also introduced to Spanish or German according to their choices. So this is a tiny country where people live with 56 languages in addition to the languages of education. So a classroom in Benin will typically look like this, where you have kids coming from different, let's say, linguistic backgrounds, and not being, speakers of French. And it is in the classroom system context that they will acquire French. And in this regard, it is important to know that out of the 7,000 languages that we are talking about, Africa, alone has about 2,000 of them. And among these 2000s, the Niger Congo languages that you find in West Africa and Central Africa actually can claim about 1,400 languages of this stuff. So the variation in this ecology is wild, right? So the perspective that we want to develop cannot be a perspective whereby the speaker learner knows its language perfectly, but the perspective that we want to develop, and which I would like to propose here, is that the human language capacity evolved multilingual and not monolingual. And in terms of universal multilingualism, what we want to assume is that universal multilingualism concerns the speaker, signer's, learner's capacity to entertain different grammars, different linguistic features that cannot be stated, within a simple monolithic grammar. And in so doing, I will make a number of hypotheses that I've developed in my recent work, whereby we want to say that during acquisition, speaker signer learners, which are now referred to as S learners, are exposed to a heterogeneous input from which they learn to master multiple linguistic subsystems, allowing communication in their communities. A second hypothesis that I would like to make is that learning actually results partly from a basic cognitive process, which I will call recombination. And this is what Selena was talking about in part of her talk. And recombination is actually what we can think of as an instance of general merge, which applies to linguistic features, whether they are phonological feature, morphological features, syntactic features, or semantic feature. So what recombination does is that it probes over relevant linguistic features within the feature pool and then merges them into new bundles of features to form new syntactic objects. Recombination then allows learners to acquire the lexicon, and in so doing, it allows learners to acquire at least three sides of the lexicon, which is the phonology, the morphology, and the semantics. And if we make this assumption, then of course we want also to keep an eye on the fact that for every single lexical item that is being learned, any of these three components can be affected by learning, can be subject to recombination. And for this, we have to naturally make the conclusion that for every single lexical item that is being learned, we have minimally 8 outputs, of which only one is the perfect output. I don't know whether you can see my mouse here. So the perfect output here is the one that have phonology 0, syntax 0, and semantics 0. Everything else is a little bit distant from the target, if we assume this to be a target. And what you can see in this analysis is that some of the creations of learners are close to the target in the sense that they have only one box that is being affected, through recombination, and you have some other recombinations that are more distant, right? My claim is that in linguistic work, when we are looking at variation and we are kind of probing into grammaticality judgment, we are probing into these different variants. So the variants that are distant are what people, from, their faces open and say, I don't like this one. It is ungrammatical or it is unacceptable in my, idiolect. And these variants, are more acceptable to most people. So recombination is actually what drives acquisition, and it also what drives change, because it comes with all these variants that are being kind of put together while speaker learners are kind of acquiring the language. And what we have here then is that every S learner develops a mental grammar of her own that is slightly distant from that of other members of the speech community. And the cumulative effect of this is what we see at the population level, and which we refer to as language change. So the idea here is that at the individual level, and this is something that generativists have known for years, at the individual level, there is always a change happening. And at the population level, we can have a change if we have a cumulative effect of individual changes, throughout the years, and that will lead us to a change at the population level. So the 7,000 languages that we find, out there are the direct result, from my perspective, of recombination and the number of, let's say, alternatives that it can actually allow S learners to produce. But what we also have to say on the basis of this is that since 7,000 languages is, a small number, it has to be the case that not everything is allowed through recombination. So there must be a constraint, or there must be a limitation on recombination. And this, I think, has to do with the fact that the S learner has to have a discovery procedure that imposes certain restrictions on the computation by filtering out, computational kind of elements which are not learnable, basically, right? Or in a sense, we can have another hypothesis that even outputs which are unlearnable can be produced, but then they will fade out from the feature pool because people would not be able to learn them. So this limitation will explain a number of languages being, limited to the 7,000 languages that we find, in the world. In the principle and parameters framework, this restriction was explained by basically assuming that, well, you can, postulate a small set of principles associated, or let's say combined with a number of parameters. And depending on how languages set these parameters, you will have language variation. But there was a fundamental, idea within the principle and parameters framework, and also in minimalism, which is that every layer of the clause can be subject to a change, can be kind of allow recombination, infinitively. So the predicate the layer can change, the inflectional domain can change, and the complementizer domain also can change, just as the DP level can change. The problem with this is that if all the domains of the structure can change, then we expect to find way more than 7,000 languages being typologically and structurally different, and we don't find that. So it cannot be the case that all components of the structure can allow change, can allow structural change. And it seems that structural variation is indeed extremely restricted, just as Chomsky actually mentioned it in his metaphor of the Martian scientist. So, how can we approach this? And the question that I'm asking this is that, okay, if it is not the case that all the domains can change, then what if actually change only happens in one structure, let's say, area in the clause? And that's the idea that I would like to follow here. The idea would basically be to say that not all syntactic domains, I mean, the predicate domain, the inflectional domain, and the complementizer domain, not all of them can change simultaneously or separately. The idea would be to say that actually across languages, some domains are kind of immune for change, and only the left peripheral properties are unstable and can allow structural change. So the idea would be that left peripheries, being phases, are the domains of structure which allow variation. And that would mean that phase level properties allow variation and not other properties in structure. And we can show this by not, making a lot of, hardcore theoretical kind of assumptions, but just by looking at the empirical data that we have out there. And what the empirical data we have out there shows is that actually when we look at the VP domain, so the domain where we have thematic hierarchy, we actually have a pretty stable system, and there is a general consensus across different approaches. You talk to functionalists, you talk to generativists, or you talk to people who don't even believe in in theories, and everybody agrees that distinct classes of verbs with their related valency properties tend to correlate with some precedent relations in thematic roles, and that is what is known as the thematic hierarchy. And there's different ways of expressing the thematic hierarchy across different kind of models, but here I give you a number of characterizations which one can find in the paper by Rappaport and Levine. But what I'll be assuming for the purpose of these presentations is basically that something like 2A is a rough characterization of how arguments map onto thematic roles. And if we assume that, and it seems that the human mind allows something like 3A, but disallows something like 3B. Okay? And that alone tells us that the VP layer, so the domain where the arguments actually map onto their thematic roles, is extremely stable cross-linguistically. And you also see the effect of this in terms of basic word orders across languages. You look at this these figures here, and it's basically shows that 80% of the languages of the world have SOV or SVO. And if you assume a framework like a Kenyan kind of approach, then we want to say that somewhere around 80% of the languages of the world actually have underlyingly SVO, and the rest, the 13 or 15% that we have, distributes over different types of word orders, which again can be derived from the two word orders that we started with, which is SOV or SVO. Okay, so this again is an empirical kind of argument that the VP layer is extremely stable. And what about the inflectional layer? There as well, in the principle and parameter framework and also in minimalism, we tend to assume that there is a lot of variation here precisely because we have languages which have verb movement as opposed to languages which don't have verb movements. We have languages with morphological encoding of tense and mood and aspect as opposed to languages which actually have free morphemes. But the truth is that when you look at how these things are spelled out in languages, you have a rich hierarchy, a very rigid hierarchy. So here I gave you examples from three different languages. Idasta in 4a, which is isolating and head final, whereby you see that aspect precedes tense, which precedes modality, right? Which precedes mood. And then we have ute, which is agglutinating and is also head final, where we have basically the same order, but in this case we have affixes which are stacking on top of the stem, the verb stem. And then you can compare this to a Creole here, Saramakan, where we have basically the same order, but this order precedes the verb, and here we see tense preceding modality, which is preceding aspect. So basically, despite the different morphologies that we have in these languages, and despite the fact that Saramakan is a Creole, so it's a language that emerged in a contact situation where we could have assumed that something, uh, unfamiliar will happen, we still have precisely the same order that we find in, the oldest languages of the world. This order whereby when you have a stem, and if you assume that these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one for aspect, two for tense, three for evidentiality, four for elocution, and five for mitigation. And I'm taking this from work by a typologist, a colleague of mine, Kees Hengefeld. Then what you find cross-linguistically is that when these elements occur to the right of the stem, to the right of the verb, they occur in the order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When they occur to the left, they occur in the mirror image. And of course, this reminds us of work that Baker did in the early 80s in terms of the mirror principle. And this is the work that Cinque actually put together in his 1999 book, where he showed that when you track the occurrence of these elements cross-linguistically, then you come up with this huge structure, which basically is a spell out of modality preceding tense, preceding modality, preceding aspect. So even the infra domain that we have been assuming to be very kind of, how do you say, varied cross-linguistically, turns out to be very stable in the sense that we have this rigid, semantic hierarchy that is spelled out in languages differently, of course, but the hierarchy is the same. So the languages instinct that we have now seems to be biased toward this specific TMA kind of sequencing. And what I would like to suggest in this case is that however we account for this bias, it has to be somehow innate. It has to be the case that learners start with this bias, okay? And however we want to account for this innateness is a different topic, but we have to assume that learners tend to go for this bias, as opposed to some other biases. And this is why we find this, astonishing uniformity cross-linguistically. And precisely the reason why we find this sequencing, even in cases where people have assumed that some languages, emerge out of, let's say, nowhere, and this will be the Creoles, right? So if you take, someone like Bickerton, his idea was that, the children created, the Creoles based on their bio program. And guess what? The Creoles actually have the same, TMA sequencing that we find across languages. So the limits on the human language is actually to be found in this TMA domain that I just talked about. So the logical conclusion that we now have, since we've seen that the kind of thematic domain is stable, the inflectional domain is also stable, then the logical conclusion that we want to draw here is that the only domain that seems to change is the left periphery. And by left periphery here, I'm talking about the C domain, the D domain, and the lower VP edge. So basically, and this, if you take this line of kind of thinking, it doesn't take you long to realize that when you really want to make, or to put down what the distinctions are between, families of languages, then these are the domains that you find to be, the most, let's say, different, cross linguistically. So you take Germanic languages, the first thing you notice is the V2 pattern that you find in Germanic languages, which you don't find, for example, in Niger Congo. So that is something that, is the hallmark of the West Germanic languages, and it is a CP layer property. You take the Romance languages, for example, Italian, and you think about Luigi Risi's work, and that's where you see wonderful things happening, within the complementizer layer. You take the Niger Congo languages, and that's also where you see, variation. So this really seems to be the levels where you find, variations. Again, you take the D level, and this is where you can make, general characterization cross-linguistically in terms of languages which have articles versus languages which don't have articles. And you can do this, just by looking at the left periphery of the nominal domain. What about the lower phase? Here again, this is where you see languages which allow, for example, object shift versus languages which don't allow it. And we know that object shift is typically related to information structure properties. So it really seems to be the case that the edge, in terms of the left periphery, is where you find robust, variation happening. So the interim conclusion here would be that language indeed varies structurally only within this level, which I'm referring to now as the left periphery, whether it's happens to be the C domain, the D domain, or the lower VP domain. And here, I think I will skip this example, but this, I'll go fast here. This example is only here to show that you can, make this kind of comparison by taking two languages like Gungwe and English, and you'll see that in Gungwe, for example, we have this sentence here, which is Kofi Donawa, and it basically means Kofi has to come. And what you see here is that the ordering in Gungwe is the same as the ordering in English, right? Has to come, Donawa is basically the same thing. But then when you look at the left periphery of these two languages, then you find, striking differences. English has, a V2-like property in, interrogative kind of constructions in WH movement, in locative inversion, or in negative inversion. Gungwe doesn't have that. So these examples here are from English. Then Gungwe actually has some other properties that English doesn't have. Gungwe has topic marker, focus marker. It has focus movement. It has a topic movement. It has embedded topic. In embedded clauses where English doesn't have. And what Gungwe has, together with some other languages, which I will kind of jump to now, is this generalized piping that you find in some structures. And this will be enough to kind of show how different this language is from English. So the fact that in Gungwe, if you're asking a question on the sentence that you have already focalized, what you do is that you put the focus marker at the, in final position of the sentence, and the focus marker is then affected by a low tone, which gives you interrogative. So you say something like, Vilo Mandu Nowhere. And in order to account for this kind of structures, what you see here is that you have this huge piping whereby actually the whole clause is being moved up to the left periphery. And again, this is something that you find in some Niger Congo languages, but it's definitely something that you don't find, across the board in all languages. So we want to say indeed that the origin of structural variation is the left periphery. And the hypothesis that I would like to make here, keeping in mind that contact is at the heart of language acquisition, then what I would like to say is that this level is vulnerable due to contact when people are exchanging, information. And this, again, is something that we've already seen in the literature. During acquisition, people have shown that, the C layer is more likely to be affected than the inflectional layer. And people have shown that, for example, advanced learners actually master, for example, for Spanish, they master, the Spanish inflectional properties, they master other properties that are related to the VP domain. But typically, what they have hard time mastering is, the post-verbal subject kind of constructions. Okay, and they also have hard times mastering where to use null subjects as opposed to full subjects, this kind of thing. And there is a lot of literature on this, right? So if you're interested in this kind of literature, you can check, many of these sources here, where they really show that, for advanced L2 learners, the CP domain and the D domain can actually be a challenge. And these are the domains that we actually postulated as being the domains where change can occur from. How am I doing in terms of time, Carlos Felipe? Can you hear me?
Yes, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can make it in 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. So the major claim that I've been making until now is to say that you know languages don't change in all domains. They don't change in the predicate domain where you have arguments being mapped onto thematic roles. They don't change in the inflectional domain, and this may come as a shock to you guys. I know that, but that's what we find out there. So it's not me making this up, and they do change, but they seem to change only within the left periphery. And this, I think, is interesting, right? Because then we can start speculating about this idea. Why is it the case that languages don't change, all over the place, but only change within the phase level, particularly, within the left periphery? And once you start thinking about this, then you already see that this idea is also compatible with the existing literature, where it's becoming clearer and clearer that information structure and its related word order patterns, determined by the left periphery, is typically source of cross-linguistic variation, and is also typically source of learning, let's say, difficulties, right? And this, I think, is interesting, because then we can put two things together. We can put together the work that formal linguists are doing, and the work that people doing applied linguistics. We can put those two things together to get to understand why is the variation so restricted, and why is the left periphery so spatial. And in that sense, I think we need to kind of come up with a different characterization. And so here, basically what I'm saying is that suppose we have these three layers: the predicative domain, following powers, the functional domain, which is the info, and the left periphery. And that's the format for all, let's say, functional projections. Nothing new here. This has been in the field for I don't know, years and years. The only idea here is that when you have this kind of format here, only the left periphery here is giving you some of the variations that you find cross-linguistically. If this is the case, then we want to ask why this level would be, the only point of typological variation. Why? I've given you a number of hints, in terms of acquisition, but we can also try to formalize this, right? So some of the speculations that I've been entertaining is to actually say, look, the left periphery, if it is a phase, then it has three fundamental properties. It is a point of spell out, right? It is a point of labeling, according to Luigi Rizzi, if you assume labeling to be part of, let's say, the computational system. And it is also an interface between the propositional content and the discourse. So this is a point where you have convergence of three different properties. And that will be the reason why it is, by default, one of the, points where learners actually have difficulties, because they need to converge these different, properties. And this, again, as I've already said, can lead to acquisition difficulties. And acquisition difficulties here, is not to be understood as learners cannot make it, right? That's not what I'm saying. By acquisition difficulties, what I mean is that actually, at this point of learning, learners will make more than one hypothesis before they can figure it out, right? So this is a point which will allow learners to make more than one hypothesis, and we can even say multiple hypotheses. And if this is a point which allows learners to make multiple hypotheses, then we are already entertaining the hypothesis that this is the points where some of these hypotheses will make it through, and some other learners will pick these hypotheses and then replicate them. So that's basically what I'm talking about here. So by difficulties, you should understand, multiplication of learning hypotheses, or you can call it ambiguity. Okay. And that, I think, is something that we have to investigate, and we have to investigate it together with our colleagues doing applied work, because here then we may start asking the question whether actually the left periphery is processed similarly to other domains in the structure. So the next speculation that I would like to make is actually that it may well be the case that the left periphery is not processed similarly to other, let's say, domains which are given, right? It may well be the case that the left periphery comes with a different types of, processing properties. And this, will go against most, let's say, minimalist assumptions, where we now draw the tree, right? We do the tree, bottom up. And once, of course, we do, cyclic spell out. But, once you do that, the processing is supposed to happen, all over the tree, right? So the thing that is being processed is actually, the final tree that is handed to, let's say, semantics and phonology. And what I'm saying is that it actually might not be the case, right? It might well be the case that there is, the asymmetry that we find between the left periphery and the inflectional domain plus the predicate domain could suggest that, the left periphery is processed differently from these other domains. And this, I think, will be in line with recent suggestions that actually syntactic processing has nothing like what syntacticians tend to, assume. It doesn't go like grouped, takes the tree and then, process it up, down. No, it seems to actually be processed, in several brain regions, even though these networks actually have to, be, in a sense, merge at some point in time, right? And these, different regions are specialized in different linguistic kind of computation. Okay, so accordingly, it may well be the case that the left periphery and, let's say, the functional, phase, or the functional domain instead, and the predicate domain are not processed similarly, though the two levels actually need to be integrated. Okay, and as far as I know, this kind of distinction is not made in current processing studies, which I think, is maybe something that we're missing out. And I would suggest that we maybe take this kind of work seriously and try it out to see whether there is something to be discovered here. So the conclusion would actually be that the empirical data that I've just discussed actually indicate that cross structure is remarkably stable when it comes to the functional domain, that is the TMA domain, and also when it comes to the predicate domain. There is limited structural cross-linguistic variation, and this limited cross-linguistic variation typically or always comes from the left periphery. The left periphery is vulnerable during acquisition and contact, and it allows more analysis leading to typological variation. The left periphery is the spell-out point as well as an interface level, and these two properties arguably cause, processing complexity. And it is further speculated that the left periphery and, let's say, the functional domain and the predicate domain are processed differently, in the brain. And I will stop here and thank you and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enoch, for your presentation. Uh, uh, People will put the question or comment in the chat, and I will project in the screen. Delaney, put.
Yeah, that's all. Let me try if I can, because I'm not very used to this system, so I
Okay.
cannot see the chat. So
You need back to the screen with me.
yeah, so I'm now in the screen with you, and I see something like Selena. How about variation? Okay, yeah. Oh, wait. Uh, Now it's okay. Now there is something here which okay. So how about variation in for some reason it's hidden. The chat is hidden. So I see, how about variation with respect to the subject position? I think that's is that the question? I think because I cannot. Oh yeah. So also there is variation in the licensing of ellipses at different domains. Okay. So variation about the subject position. I think that can be easily approached from precisely what typologists have been talking about, uh, which is that the subject position, even though we call it a subject position, has a lot of affinities with topics, right? And functionalists have been talking about this for, I mean, for generations. So it may well be the case that things that we're calling subject positions are not actually inside TP as we want them to be, but actually somewhere inside, the lower portion of the left periphery. And I've actually shown this for the Bay languages. So we have pretty good evidence from the Bay languages to show that the subject actually shows up in spec fin P if you use the Rhesus kind of, in the lower domain of the left periphery. And this will carry on to, languages where we have, subjects actually having some, topic like properties, or sometimes subjects actually also carrying these kind of evidential kind of properties and so on. And all these things we know are within the C domain. They are not within, the traditional TP. So that's one answer. The other answer about ellipses is also very interesting, because then if we take, Jason's work about ellipses, which basically assumes that ellipsis is licensed under focus, then of course, ellipsis is happening within the left, within the left periphery. However, we kind of define that. And keep in mind that, by left periphery, I'm not only talking about the closal level, I'm also talking about, the lower, VP phase, right? So those will actually account for those cases. So the variation there again can be reduced to a variation, within, the left periphery. Yeah. Now I don't know whether I.
Yes, Jairo Nunes asks.
Yeah. So Jairo, hi. Yeah, it's interesting because I cannot see you guys, but I'm really happy that you are here. And yeah, so you said from your presentation, it seems that the stable part could be within the language faculty or external to it. Yeah. Do you have a side on this issue? Yeah, I was expecting this question to come. Yeah. um, you know. If I don't want to be controversial, so we are within generativist, so we can say this easily. I actually think that this bias is given. You know, I insisted that the TMA is given because I think we have strong empirical evidence for that. So I really want to say that this is part of the language faculty, however we define it. And that's obviously not something that Chomsky would like to say, because he would like to say that the language faculty only contains merge. But I think just merge cannot get you the fact that all languages show this sequencing, right? So that I think we have good reasons to say that it's innate. I was trying to say, even though it is innate, I will have hard time saying this is genetically specified. So that's why, I said it is innate, or we have a bias for that. So I'm still not clear how we want to account for this, but whatever solution we have to find, it has to explain the fact that children have this bias. And it also has to explain the fact that even though this, let's say TMA layer is extremely complex morphologically speaking, it shows, a wide range of variation. Children are extremely fast in acquiring it. This is something that Wexler actually showed in his work. And he called, he said children are inflection machines, right? So this is something that Wexler said in his work. How problem learning this, even though they have problems learning, CP related issue. And for me, they don't have any problem learning this because they have this bias. So they don't have to worry about, the semantic hierarchy that is kind of driving the system. They only worry about the morphological kind of specifications. Now, where I get a little bit less secure in this discussion has to do with the predicate phrase, right? So I don't know whether we want to say also that, the thematic hierarchy is also given. That's something that I don't know how to get, through. Yeah. But yeah, my side on this issue would be to say that I think, this is a discovery that we've made, and we should stick by it. It's one of the most striking properties of language that, all the languages of the world have this property.
Renato has another
Yeah.
question or suggestion.
Yeah.
Once
So I have once suggested that IP internal topics cannot be preceded by new information in their own domain, TP, but can be, oh, that it's gone, but can be preceded by new information in separate domain, CP. That seems to fit well. Yeah, very well indeed. And it also fits in the way data where you have the same thing. You can have this kind of concatenations of topic and focus. If you have them across, let's say no. So in the Bay languages, it will be the reverse. Yeah, no. Let me take this back. So in the Bay languages, you can have a concatenation of topic and focus within the same clause, right? And you can have this, you can have multiple clauses. So you can have topic focus in the matrix, topic focus in embedded, and that's fine. So your suggestion actually, again, will go, fit well, because it suggests that this will be where languages would, be different again, right? And we know that for Romance and Germanic, at least for Italian, if I'm going by work by Luigi, so for Luigi, you cannot have two foci in the same clause, for example, but you also cannot have two foci in the same sentence. So Italian will be different from Fongbe in that, or Gungbe in that respect, because in Gungbe and Fongbe and the Bay languages in general, you can have, two foci in the same sentence, provided that they are in, separate clauses. Yeah.
Enoch, thank you very much for your talk. To me, it's a pleasure to receive you here in your fourth EGG. I see you tomorrow in the university.
Thank
Thank you
you
so
very much. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks to everybody, and hello to my dear friends, Jairo and Selena, and hopefully we will meet soon. Yeah.
Eu coloquei, I put in the chat the link for the close, enfim, o encerramento da the meet. Okay,
Okay.
you can click there and we see next. Bye bye.
Okay. Okay. Bye bye. So I'll do that. See you.